We stopped laughing exactly 47 minutes later, but by then, it didn't matter anymore. I had been working cargo intake on Terminus 7 for 19 standard cycles, long enough to watch entire species come and go, long enough to believe there was nothing left in this galaxy that could surprise me. Not the towering Vraxians who could lift a transport crate like it weighed 10 pounds, not the glass-skinned Delthorians who could refract light into weapons. Not even the crawl beasts that required reinforced magnetic cages just to keep them from tearing through a docking bay. I had seen it all, cataloged it, dismissed it, and filed it under understood. And that was my first mistake, because understanding makes you comfortable and comfort makes you blind. And on that particular shift, with the stale recycled air humming through the vents and the smell of engine coolant hanging low across the loading floor, I was comfortable leaning against a stack of shipping containers, half listening to Gorith brag about his latest contract while a dozen other workers moved freight in. Lazy, practiced rhythms, the kind of routine that turns hours into background noise, until the airlock hissed open and everything paused just long enough for me to notice the smallest thing in the room. He stepped in without hesitation, no dramatic entrance, no armor plating, no visible tech enhancements, just a human about 5.5 feet tall by my estimate, maybe 160 pounds at most, wearing a plain utility jumpsuit that looked like it had seen better days, neutral colors. No insignia worth mentioning, the kind of outfit designed to be ignored. And for a moment, that's exactly what happened. Nobody reacted, nobody cared, because in a bay full of creatures that could snap steel with their bare hands, a human barely registered as relevant. But then Gorith saw him, and Gorith always needed an audience. His laugh started low, a grinding sound like stone shifting under pressure. And then it grew louder, sharper, echoing across the metal walls, until others picked it up, one by one, until the entire bay was filled with that same mocking rhythm. It spread fast, faster than logic, faster than restraint, because that's how it always works out here. One voice sets the tone, and the rest follow. And suddenly the human wasn't just a worker walking in. He was the center of attention, the smallest target in a room full of very large egos. I remember thinking how predictable it was, how simple the pattern seemed. Small equals weak, weak equals entertainment, entertainment equals safe. That was the rule everyone believed, the rule I believed, the rule that had never failed us. Before, the human stopped walking when the laughter peaked. Not abruptly, not defensively, just a quiet pause like he was recalculating something. His hands hung loosely at his sides, fingers relaxed, not clenched, not trembling, just still. And that should have been the second sign, because most species react, they flinch, they posture, they escalate, they try to prove something, but this one didn't. He just stood there, looking around the bay, with a kind of calm curiosity that didn't match the situation at all. His eyes moved from face to face, steady, focused, like he was measuring distance instead of threats. And I caught myself noticing details I shouldn't have cared about. The way his posture stayed balanced, weight evenly distributed, the way his breathing didn't change despite the noise, the way he didn't rush to speak or defend himself. He just existed. And in a place like Terminus 7, existing without reacting is almost unnatural. Gorith pushed out from his crate, still grinning, still enjoying the attention, and started walking toward him, slow, deliberate. Every step of performance, the crowd shifted to give him space, anticipation replacing the laughter, because now it was turning into something more structured, something everyone understood, intimidation dressed up as tradition, and the human didn't move, didn't step back, didn't even shift his stance. He just watched Gorith approach like he was watching something mildly interesting instead of something dangerous, and for a brief second, just a flicker, I felt something I hadn't felt in years on this station. Not fear, not yet, but something close to it. Something like uncertainty, because the pattern was playing out exactly as expected, except for one detail that didn't fit. The human wasn't acting like the role we had already assigned him, and deep down, before anything actually happened, before a single word was exchanged, I realized we might have made a mistake, but by then, the laughter had already echoed too far to take back. By that point, I should have stepped in, because part of my job as cargo supervisor was to prevent situations from escalating into something that would require incident reports and disciplinary logs. But the truth is I did not move, None of US did because everything still looked normal on the surface. It looked like the same pattern we had seen hundreds of times before. A larger worker asserting dominance over a smaller one. A quick exchange of words, maybe a minor dispute, and then everyone would move on. That was how it always went. And routine is a powerful thing. It convinces you that tomorrow will look exactly like yesterday. Gorth stopped about 3 feet in front of the human, towering over him by nearly 2 full heads, his shadow stretching across the deck, plating like a warning sign that nobody bothered to read, and the noise in the bay softened into a low murmur. Not silence, never silence, but close enough that every word would carry. Gorth tilted his head slightly, studying the human like he was trying to decide what kind of joke he was looking at. And when he finally spoke, his voice rolled out slow and heavy, thick with amusement that had not yet found its punchline. "You lost, little guy," he said, drawing out each word just enough to let the crowd lean into it. "This bay is for actual work, not whatever you were supposed to be." A few scattered laughs followed, weaker this time, more focused, like the crowd was waiting for something better, something sharper, and all eyes shifted back to the human, expecting the usual response, a stammer, a defensive explanation, maybe even a retreat, because that is what smaller species tend to do. When faced with something bigger, they negotiate, they deflect, they try to survive the moment, but the human did none of that. He simply looked up at Gorth, not with defiance, not with fear, just with a kind of steady attention that felt misplaced in a situation like this. And for a second, it almost looked like he was about to say something important, something that might redirect the entire interaction. But when he spoke, his voice was calm, even completely free of urgency. "I am here for a pickup," he said, as if that was the only detail that mattered, as if the entire situation could be reduced to a simple transaction. And that was it. No explanation, no apology, no attempt to match Gorth's tone. Just a statement, clean and direct. And the simplicity of it landed in a strange way because it did not feed the moment. It did not escalate it. It just sat there unanswered, and I saw Gorth's expression shift ever so slightly. Not enough for most to notice, but enough for someone who had watched him for years. A brief hesitation, a flicker of recalculation. Because dominance relies on reaction. It needs resistance or fear to anchor itself. And when it gets neither, it has to adjust. Gorth let out another laugh, louder this time, forcing the energy back into the room. "A pickup," he repeated, glancing over his shoulder at the others. "Did you all hear that? It has a job." The crowd responded on cue, laughter returning, stronger now, more coordinated, because it was easier to laugh than to question what did not make sense, and I felt that same pull. That same instinct to fall back into the familiar rhythm. But something in the human's posture kept pulling my attention back. He had not moved, not even an inch. His feet stayed planted, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze steady, and it was not the stillness of someone frozen, it was the stillness of someone waiting, and that difference, subtle as it was, started to feel important. Gorth stepped closer, closing the distance until there was barely a foot between them. His presence filling the space like a wall that had no intention of letting anything pass. "You know how this works," he said, lowering his voice just enough to make people lean in. "New arrivals pay a handling fee. Keeps things smooth." It was not an official rule. Everyone knew that, but it was common enough that nobody challenged it. Not openly. And again, the human did not react the way anyone expected. He did not argue, did not ask for clarification, did not even look around for support. He just held Gorth's gaze for a moment longer, and then, with the same calm tone, he said, "I am not paying for something I did not request." And that was when the room shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that the laughter faded into something thinner, something uncertain, because the script had changed, just slightly, just enough to make the next step unclear. And in a place where everyone relies on predictable patterns to stay safe, even a small deviation can feel like the beginning of something much bigger. The problem with confidence is that it looks exactly like arrogance when you are standing on the wrong side of it. And in that moment, with Gorth looming over him and the entire cargo bay watching, the human's calm refusal did not register as strength to most of the room. It registered as ignorance, and ignorance, in a place like Terminus 7, was often corrected quickly. I saw in the way a few workers shifted their stance, leaning forward slightly, anticipating the next move, the expected escalation because once a demand was made and rejected, the pattern usually moved into its final stage. Gorith's expression hardened. Not into anger. Not yet, but into something more deliberate. The kind of focus that meant he was no longer performing for the crowd. He was adjusting to a problem. "You are new," he said slowly, as if explaining something simple to someone who should already understand it. "So I will make this easy for you." His voice dropped just enough to pull the room tighter. "Around the moment, you either learn how things work here, or you make things difficult for yourself." It was not a threat in the way some species delivered them, loud and obvious. It was quieter, more controlled, the kind of statement that carried weight because it did not need to be emphasized. And again, the human did not respond the way anyone expected. He did not rush to speak, did not interrupt, did not even glance away. He simply listened, as if Gorith was giving him useful information, instead of trying to pressure him into compliance. And that was when I noticed something else, something that did not fit the situation at all. The human's breathing remained steady, completely unchanged, no quickening, no tension, just a consistent rhythm, like his body had decided this moment did not require any adjustment, and that detail, small as it was, started to feel out of place. Because even the most experienced workers here showed some physical response when confronted directly, a shift in posture, a tightening of muscles, something, anything, but this human remained exactly the same, like the environment had no effect on him. Gorith took another step forward, closing the distance until they were nearly shoulder to chest, his presence filling the human's field of view. And for a brief second, I expected the human to step back, not out of fear, but out of instinct. Because space matters in interactions like this, it defines boundaries, control, intent, but he did not move, not even a fraction of an inch. He held his position like it was already decided, like there was no alternative outcome to consider, and that was when the crowd started to quiet again. Not completely, but enough that the energy shifted from amusement to attention, because now the situation was no longer predictable. Gorith extended one hand slightly, not touching, not yet, just enough to emphasize proximity, and said, "Last chance." The words were simple, almost routine, but they carried the full weight of expectation behind them. This was the moment where things usually resolved, one way or another, compliance or consequence. And the human finally responded, not with a raised voice, not with a defensive posture, but with the same calm tone he had used from the beginning. "I understand what you were saying," he said, pausing just long enough to make sure the words settled, "but I am not part of your system." And something about that sentence landed differently than anything else he had said so far, because it was not just a refusal, it was a rejection of the entire framework the situation was built on, and I saw it ripple through the crowd, confusion first, then irritation, because when someone refuses to play by the expected rules, it creates a gap, a space where the next move is not obvious. And in that space, people start to feel uncertain. Gorith's jaw tightened slightly, the first clear sign that this was no longer going according to plan. He glanced briefly to the side, as if checking the reaction of the others, and then back at the human, recalculating, adjusting, try to reassert control over a situation that was slipping just enough to be noticeable. And that was when I felt it again, that same quiet sense that something was off, not in a dramatic way, not yet, but in a subtle, persistent way that made it hard to look away, because everything about this interaction should have been simple, straightforward, already resolved, and it was not. It was stretching, extending, building in a direction none of us had anticipated, and somewhere in the back of my mind a thought started to form, slow and unwelcome, that maybe the human was not the one out of place here. Maybe it was the rest of us who had misunderstood the situation from the very beginning. There's a moment in every controlled environment when control becomes an illusion, and you can feel it before anything actually happens, not through sound, not through movement, but through the absence of what should be there. And in that cargo bay, what should have been there was certainty, the simple, reliable certainty that Gorith would resolve the situation the way he always did, but that certainty was starting to thin, stretched across a situation that refused to behave. Gorith lowered his hand slowly, not because he had decided to de-escalate, but because the expected reaction had not arrived, and without that reaction, the gesture itself lost its purpose. He studied the human again, more carefully this time, eyes narrowing just enough to show that something had shifted in his assessment, and I saw others in the crowd doing the same, small adjustments in posture, slight tilts of the head, the kind of unconscious recalibration that happens when a pattern breaks, because we all knew the rules. Everyone on Terminus 7 operated under the same unspoken understanding, size determined. Hierarchy, presence enforced it, and compliance maintained it, but the human standing there, barely reaching Gorth's chest, was not complying, not resisting in the usual way either, just existing outside the structure entirely. And that was harder to process than outright defiance. "You think you're different," Gorth said, his tone losing some of its earlier amusement, replaced now with something more analytical. Like he was trying to categorize a problem that did not fit into any known file. The human did not respond immediately, and the pause stretched just long enough to draw attention. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just a natural gap that forced everyone listening to lean into it. "No," he said finally, voice steady, unforced, "I know I am." And that answer did something to the room, not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that settled into the space between people, because it was not a challenge. It was not a boast. It was a statement delivered without the need for validation. And statements like that are difficult to dismiss. Gorth exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, measured, as if he was deliberately choosing his next move instead of reacting, and that alone told me more than anything else had so far, because Gorth did not hesitate. Not unless something forced him to. He shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance, and for a brief moment it looked like he might step back, might reset the interaction entirely. But instead he did something unexpected. He looked past the human, scanning the bay, not searching for help, but checking the environment, as if something beyond the immediate situation had entered his calculations, and I followed his gaze instinctively, sweeping across the rows of containers, the overhead lighting grids, the distant loading ramps. Everything looked the same, routine, controlled, predictable, and yet there was a subtle change in the atmosphere, something that had nothing to do with Gorth or the human directly, a faint vibration underfoot, barely noticeable, the kind of low-frequency hum that usually gets filtered out by experience, but once you notice it, you cannot ignore it. I felt it through the deck plating, a steady, almost rhythmic pulse, like something large had just shifted somewhere beyond the visible sections of the station. A few others seemed to pick up on it as well, their attention flickering away from the confrontation for just a second before snapping back. Unsure whether it mattered, Gorth noticed it too. I could tell by the slight tightening of his shoulders, the way his focus split for just a fraction of a second. And that was when the balance tipped, not fully, not dramatically, but enough to create a crack in the situation, because dominance depends on total attention, and the moment that attention is divided, even slightly, the structure begins to weaken. The human, however, did not look away, did not react to the shift in the environment. He remained exactly as he had been from the start, center composed, as if whatever was happening beyond the immediate moment was already accounted for. And that detail, more than anything else, made my instincts sharpen, because it suggested awareness, not of the confrontation, but of something larger, something approaching. The hum deepened slightly, still subtle, still easy to dismiss if you wanted to, but it was there, persistent, growing, and for the first time since the airlock had opened, I felt a clear sense of unease settle into my chest. Not because of what Gorth might do next, but because of the possibility that the situation was never about him in the first place, that the human standing there, calm and unmoved, was not reacting to the environment, because he did not need to, because whatever was about to happen was already in motion, and we were just now beginning to notice it. The hum did not belong to the normal rhythm of the station, and once it registered, it refused to fade back into the background. It sat there under everything, a low, steady presence that felt too deliberate to ignore, and I saw it spread through the room in subtle ways. Workers pausing mid-motion, a few glances exchanged between those who had been here long enough to recognize when something was off. Not alarm, not yet, but awareness, the kind that sharpens your senses without fully Understanding why, Gorith noticed it too. I could see it in the way his focus shifted again, just briefly, his attention no longer locked entirely on the human. And that was all it took for the moment to change, because dominance is fragile when it depends on uninterrupted control, and interruptions, even small ones, create openings. The human, however, remained completely unaffected, still standing in the same relaxed posture, eyes steady, expression neutral, as if the growing tension in the room did not apply to him, as if he had already accounted for whatever was coming next. And that realization, quiet but persistent, started to press against my earlier assumptions, because this was no longer just about a disagreement in a cargo bay. Something else was aligning beneath the surface, something larger than Gorith, larger than the crowd, larger than the routine we all relied on. The hum deepened again, just a fraction, but enough that the deck plating beneath my feet carried it more clearly, a slow pulse, measured, controlled, not chaotic like a system failure, not sharp like a warning alarm, but steady, intentional, and that distinction mattered because it suggested design, not accident. Gorith straightened slightly, his posture adjusting from casual intimidation to alert awareness. And for the first time since the human had entered, he did not speak immediately. He listened, just like the rest of us, tried to identify the source, the cause, the significance, and that silence, that shared pause across the entire bay, did something to the energy. It stripped away the last remnants of mockery and replaced them with something more cautious, more focused, because when something unfamiliar enters a controlled environment, the first instinct is to reassess, to determine whether the rules still apply. The human finally moved, but not in the way anyone expected. Not a step back, not a defensive shift, just a slight turn of his head, barely noticeable, as if he was aligning his attention with something outside the immediate confrontation. His gaze flicked past Gorith, toward the far end of the bay, with a larger docking gates connected to the external cargo lanes. And for a second, I followed that line of sight without thinking, expecting to see something obvious, something that would explain the growing tension. But the gates remained closed, the indicators steady, no flashing warnings, no visible anomalies. Everything appeared normal. And yet the hum continued, persistent, deliberate, impossible to dismiss now that it had been noticed. Gorith's voice returned, but had changed, not louder, not more aggressive, just tighter, more controlled. "What is that?" he said, not to the human, not to anyone in particular, just into the space, as if the question itself might produce an answer. No one responded, because no one knew, and uncertainty in a place like this spreads quickly, not through panic, but through attention, every eye now shifting between the human and the far end of the bay, trying to connect the two, trying to understand if they were related. And that was when the realization started to form, slow and unwelcome, that maybe they were, that the human's calm, his refusal to engage, his complete lack of reaction to the escalating situation, was not confidence in himself, but confidence in something else, something approaching, something already in motion. The hum pulsed again, stronger this time, enough that a few loose tools on a nearby cart vibrated slightly against a metal surface, producing a faint, irregular clatter that cut through the silence. Gorith took a step back, not a retreat, not exactly, but a repositioning, creating just enough distance to widen his field of view. And that single step, small as it was, shifted the entire dynamic of the room, because the one who had been controlling the interaction was no longer fully committed to it. His attention divided, his certainty fractured, and in that space, that narrow gap between expectation and reality, something new began to take shape. The human's gaze returned to Gorith for a brief moment, and for the first time, there was a hint of something different in his expression. Not aggression, not satisfaction, just quiet confirmation, as if a timeline he had been following had reached the point he expected. And then he spoke, softly, almost casually, "You might want to step back," and the simplicity of that suggestion, delivered without urgency, without emphasis, landed in a way that felt heavier than any threat could have, because it was not a warning meant to intimidate. It was information, and information, when delivered at the right moment, can change everything. The words should have sounded like a bluff, like another attempt to shift control without actually holding it, but they did not land that way, not in that moment, not with that tone, because there was no urgency behind them, no strain, no attempt to convince. Just a simple statement delivered at exactly the right time, and that was what made it difficult to ignore. Gorith did not move immediately, but I saw the hesitation. Clear this time, not hidden behind performance or posture, just a brief pause where instinct and logic pulled in different directions. And in that pause, the hum intensified again, not louder in a dramatic sense, but deeper, more present, like it had moved closer, like whatever was causing it had crossed some invisible threshold. The deck beneath us carried it more clearly now, a steady vibration that traveled up through the soles of my boots and settled into my legs and around the bay. Small reactions began to ripple outward. A worker near the far wall stepped back from a stack of containers. Another glanced up toward the overhead gantries, searching for a source that was not there. The lighting remained stable, the indicators unchanged, but the environment no longer felt static. It felt active, as if something beyond our immediate perception had entered the space. Gorith finally shifted, not fully retreating, but stepping half a pace back, enough to widen the gap between himself and the human, enough to re-establish distance without admitting uncertainty. And that single movement carried more weight than any words could have, because it acknowledged the possibility that the human suggestion was not empty, that it might be based on something real, something approaching. The crowd responded in kind, subtle adjustments spreading outward, individuals repositioning, creating space where there had been none, not out of panic, but out of instinct, the kind that tells you to make room when something larger is about to arrive. And still, the human did not change. He remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, posture relaxed, gaze steady, completely aligned with whatever was unfolding, and that consistency, that refusal to react even as the environment shifted around him, made him stand out more now than when he first entered, because now the contrast was not between him and Gorith. It was between him and everyone else. We were adjusting, recalculating, responding. And he was not. He was simply waiting. The hum pulsed again, stronger, and this time it carried a secondary vibration, a faint metallic resonance that echoed through the structure of the bay, like distant machinery engaging, slow and deliberate. And then, for the first time, the far docking gates responded, not with a sudden movement, but with a subtle shift in their locking mechanisms. A series of controlled clicks that cut through the air in a precise sequence, drawing every eye toward them. The massive doors remained closed for a moment longer, but the system lights along their edges flickered from idle blue to active amber, signaling a change in status, a transition from static to operational. And that was when the atmosphere changed completely, because those gates did not open without reason, not during standard operations, not without clearance, not without something significant on the other side. Gorith turned fully now, his attention no longer divided, his focus locked onto the doors. And for the first time since the human had entered, he was no longer the center of the situation. He was just another observer, just another participant in something larger than himself. The crowd followed his gaze, the entire bay aligning toward the same point, the same source, the same unknown. And in that collective shift, the earlier tension between Gorith and the human dissolved, replaced by something broader, something that encompassed all of us. The hum reached a steady peak, not overwhelming, but undeniable, and then it stabilized, holding at a constant level that felt intentional, controlled, like the final note before a reveal. The human took a single step, to the side, not away, not back, just enough to clear the direct line between himself and the gates. And the movement was so minimal, so precise, that it felt less like a reaction and more like preparation, as if he was making space for something he already expected to see. And that was when I understood, not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize the pattern. This was never about a confrontation in a cargo bay. It was never about dominance or hierarchy or any of the rules we thought governed this place. It was about timing, about alignment, about being in the right position when something significant arrived. And the human had been in that position from the very beginning, not by accident, but by design. And As the locking mechanisms completed their sequence and the first faint separation lines appeared along the edges of the massive doors, I felt the last remnants of my earlier certainty disappear, replaced by a single, undeniable realization. We were no longer in control of what was about to happen, and whatever came through those gates, it was not coming for us, it was coming to him. The separation line along the docking gates widened by less than an inch at first, but in a space where every eye was already locked onto that point. Even that small movement carried weight, the kind that pulls silence across a room without anyone needing to say a word. The amber status lights along the edges pulsed once, then again, steady and controlled, confirming that whatever clearance had been granted was not a routine override, but a deliberate authorization, and the sound that followed was not loud, not dramatic, just a deep, measured shift of reinforced metal moving against precision locks, the kind of sound you feel more than hear, traveling through the structure of the station and settling into your bones. The crowd did not move forward, did not rush for a better view. Instead, they held position, instinctively maintaining distance, as if something inside them recognized that closing the gap would be a mistake. Gorith remained where he had repositioned himself, no longer the focal point, no longer directing the flow of the moment, his attention fixed entirely on the opening gates, and I could see the change in him clearly now. Not fear, not exactly, but a recalibration so complete that it erased the earlier confidence he had carried. The human stood slightly off to the side, exactly where he had moved, not obstructing the path, not claiming it, simply allowing it to exist. And that placement, subtle as it was, felt intentional, like he understood the geometry of the moment better than anyone else in the room. The gap between the doors expanded slowly, revealing darkness beyond, not empty space, but the interior of a docking channel large enough to accommodate vessels far beyond standard cargo traffic, and the hum that had been building resolved into something more defined, a layered resonance, mechanical and organic at the same time, steady, controlled, unmistakably alive in a way that did not fit any system I was familiar with. A faint current of air shifted through the bay as pressure equalized, carrying with it a scent that did not belong to recycled station atmosphere. Something sharper, cleaner, like open space filtered through unfamiliar systems, and that alone was enough to make several workers take another step back, not out of panic, but out of instinct, because new environments bring unknown variables, and unknown variables require distance. The opening widened further, enough now to reveal the outline of something within the docking channel. Not fully visible, not yet defined, just a shape that absorbed light rather than reflected it, large enough that it distorted the sense of scale around it, and the reaction across the bay was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but focused, every posture tightening, every gaze narrowing, attention sharpening to a single point, trying to resolve what the eyes could not yet fully process. Gorith's shoulders squared slightly, not in dominance this time, but in readiness, the kind that comes from recognizing that something significant is about to enter your space. And for a brief moment, I saw him glance toward the human again, not as a target, not as an opponent, but as a reference, as if trying to measure the situation through him. And the human, in contrast, remained unchanged, his breathing steady, his stance relaxed, his gaze fixed forward, not searching, not questioning, just waiting, and that consistency, that complete alignment with the unfolding moment, made everything else feel reactive by comparison. The shape within the docking channel shifted forward, just enough to break the boundary of shadow. And with that movement, the hum deepened into a stable presence that filled the bay without overwhelming it. A controlled power, restrained but undeniable. The kind that does not need to assert itself because it already occupies the space completely. The doors continued their slow retraction, revealing more of the form beyond, contours becoming clearer, lines emerging from shadow into the station lighting. And still no one spoke, because whatever was arriving had already claimed the room without a single word. And in that silence, with the entire cargo bay holding its breath in quiet anticipation, the realization settled fully into place. This was not an interruption. This was an arrival. and the human had not just anticipated it. He had positioned himself for it, as if the entire sequence from the moment he stepped through the airlock to the second those gates began to open had been part of a timeline only he understood. And as the first true details of the presence beyond the doors came into view, I understood something else just as clearly. Whatever was entering this bay, it was not responding to us. It was responding to him. At first it did not make sense, because the shape that emerged from the shadow did not move like a machine, and it did not present itself like any known cargo vessel or station equipment. It advanced with a controlled precision that felt deliberate, but not mechanical. Each motion smooth in a way that suggested awareness rather than programming. And as more of it came into the light, the scale became impossible to ignore. It filled the width of the docking threshold with ease, its frame, stretching far beyond what any standard classification would allow inside a civilian cargo sector. And yet there it was, crossing into our space as if it belonged there. The surface of it was not uniform, not metallic in the traditional sense, but layered, textured, reflecting light in muted tones that shifted subtly as it moved, like something designed for environments far harsher than a station bay. And the hum that accompanied it was no longer just a background vibration. It had become a presence, a constant, steady resonance that seemed to align with its movement, as if the two were connected, as if the sound itself was part of what it was. And around me, I could feel the shift in the others. Not panic, not yet, but recognition, the kind that happens when instinct identifies something before the mind has time to categorize it. Goreth did not step forward this time, did not attempt to reassert control or claim the moment. He held his position, shoulders squared but no longer dominant, his attention fully captured by what was entering the bay. And I saw something else in him now, something I had never seen before. Not uncertainty, but restraint, the deliberate choice to not interfere. Because interfering no longer made sense, the entity moved further into the light, revealing more of its structure, powerful lines, balanced proportions, every part of it suggesting purpose. Not excess, not decoration, just function refined to its highest level. And still no one spoke, because whatever this was, it did not invite commentary. It commanded observation. The distance between it and the human closed gradually, not rushed, not aggressive, just inevitable, like 2 points on a path that had already been drawn long before any of us were aware of it. And the human finally shifted his stance slightly, not to prepare, not to defend, just to face it directly, aligning himself with its approach in a way that felt natural, expected, as if this was the only outcome that had ever been possible. The entity slowed as it reached the central line of the bay, its movement easing into stillness with the same controlled precision it had shown from the beginning. And in that stillness, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything to define what this moment actually meant. The human took a single step forward, closing the last few feet between them. And even that small movement felt significant, because it was the first time he had advanced instead of simply existing in place. And still, there was no tension in him, no visible sign of caution or concern, just quiet certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself. Goreth's gaze shifted again, moving from the entity to the human and back, trying to connect the two, trying to understand the relationship that had been implied but not yet confirmed. And I felt the same question forming in my own mind. Not what this thing was, but why it had come here, why it had entered this specific bay at this exact moment, and why the human standing in front of it showed no surprise, no confusion, no reaction at all. As if this encounter was not unexpected, but scheduled, the entity lowered slightly, not in weakness, not in submission, but in adjustment, aligning its height with the human's position in a way that made the interaction feel balanced rather than hierarchical. And that single motion sent a ripple through the room, subtle but undeniable, because it contradicted everything we believed about scale and dominance. Something that large did not adjust itself for something that small, not in any system we understood, and yet it had, without hesitation, without resistance, as if the adjustment was the most natural thing in the world. And in that moment, before any words were spoken, before any clear action defined what we were witnessing, The realization settled in with quiet certainty. This was not an encounter between unequal forces. This was a meeting between equals, and we had been wrong from the very beginning. No one had prepared us for stillness like that. Not in a cargo bay, not in a place built on constant motion and noise and routine, because stillness in a place like Terminus 7 usually meant something had gone wrong. But this was different. This was not a failure. This was a pause, deliberate and controlled, like the entire environment had been recalibrated around a single interaction. The entity remained lowered, its massive frame balanced with precise control, its presence filling the space, without overwhelming it, and the human stood directly in front of it, close enough now that the difference in scale should have been absurd, should have reinforced everything we believed about size and power. But instead it did the opposite. It made the contrast feel irrelevant because the way they faced each other did not follow any known hierarchy. It felt equal, measured, intentional. The human lifted his head slightly, meeting whatever passed for the entity's focus. And for a moment, nothing happened. No sound, no movement, just that quiet alignment. And then the hum shifted, not louder, not stronger, but more defined, like a signal being tuned into clarity, and I realized that it was not random. It had structure, a pattern, almost like communication without words, something that carried meaning even if we could not decode it. A few workers closer to the edges of the bay began to step back further now, not out of fear, but out of respect, the kind that comes from recognizing that you are witnessing something you are not meant to interrupt. Gorith did not move at all, his earlier presence completely replaced by still observation, his attention locked onto the interaction unfolding in front of him. And for the first time since I had known him, he did not try to insert himself into the moment. He simply watched because there was nothing for him to control anymore. The human raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, not in defense, not in challenge. Just a small, controlled motion that seemed almost insignificant compared to the scale of the entity. And yet the effect was immediate. The hum stabilized, locking into a steady frequency that felt less like background noise and more like acknowledgement. The entity adjusted again, not dramatically, just enough to align more precisely with the human's position. And that subtle movement carried a weight that none of us could ignore, because it confirmed what we had only begun to suspect. This was not coincidence. This was response. The human's presence was not incidental. It was central, the reason for the arrival, the focus of the interaction, and everything about the moment reinforced that truth. The human spoke then, his voice calm, steady, carrying clearly through the silence. "You took your time," he said, and the words, simple as they were, landed with unexpected weight, because they implied familiarity, expectation, a prior connection that none of us had considered possible. And the hum answered, not with language, but with a subtle shift in tone, a modulation that felt like a reply, like a confirmation that the statement had been understood. Gorith's head turned slightly toward me, just enough that I could see the question in his expression, not spoken, not formed into words, but present all the same, because we were both realizing the same thing at the same time. This was not a first meeting. This was not a random encounter. This was a continuation, something that had been established long before this moment, long before this station, long before any of us had been aware of it. The human lowered his hand again, his posture unchanged, his composure absolute. And in that moment, I understood why he had not reacted earlier, why he had not engaged with Gorith, why he had stood there through the laughter and the pressure without shifting even slightly. It was not restraint. It was perspective. Everything that had happened before this had been irrelevant to him. Background noise in a sequence that was always going to lead here. The entity remained steady, its presence calm but undeniable, and for a brief second, the entire cargo bay existed in a kind of suspended clarity, where the old rules no longer applied and the new ones had not yet been defined. And in that space, with the human and the entity facing each other as if nothing else mattered, the final piece fell into place. We had not been watching a confrontation at all. We had been watching a delay, a waiting period before something inevitable arrived. And now that it had everything we thought we understood about strength, about hierarchy, about who belonged at the top of any system, was already beginning to shift. What happened next did not begin with movement. It began with recognition, the kind that does not need translation, the kind that bypasses language entirely and settles directly into instinct. The entity held its position for a fraction longer, the hum maintaining that. Steady, controlled resonance. And then it shifted again, not forward, not upward, but inward, a subtle contraction of posture that made something impossibly large feel focused, like all of its presence had narrowed onto a single point, onto him. The human did not react outwardly, but there was a change, small, almost imperceptible, a slight lift of his chin, a quiet acknowledgement that matched the entity's adjustment perfectly, as if both were following the same unspoken script. And then it happened, not loud, not dramatic, but clear, unmistakable. The hum altered into a pattern so precise it could no longer be dismissed as ambient. It carried cadence now, rhythm, intent, and even though none of us had ever heard anything like it before, we understood it, not the words, but the meaning, the weight behind it, the way it was directed, focused entirely on the human. The entity leaned forward just slightly, enough to close the last fraction of distance between them, and in that moment, the entire cargo bay seemed to compress around the interaction, every eye fixed, every breath held, every assumption waiting to be confirmed or shattered. The sound resolved into something structured, something deliberate. And then the translation systems embedded in the station, passive and always listening, did what they were designed to do. They interpreted, they aligned, they rendered meaning into something we could process. And the result came through not as a broadcast, not as a command, but as a simple, clear statement, delivered in a tone that carried neither threat nor uncertainty. Little brother, the words settled into the air with a weight that no one could ignore, and the effect was immediate, not explosive, not chaotic, but absolute. The entire room shifted in a way that felt irreversible because that phrase, simple as it was, redefined everything we had just witnessed. Gorith froze where he stood, not out of fear, but out of complete recalibration, his earlier framework collapsing under the realization that the hierarchy he relied on did not apply here, not even remotely. The others reacted in smaller ways, subtle steps back, slight turns of the head, the kind of movements that signal a collective adjustment to a new reality, and I felt it just as strongly, that quiet, undeniable shift in understanding. Because an apex entity, something that large, something that controlled, did not use terms like that lightly. It did not assign relationship without reason, and the implication was clear. The human was not beneath it, not subordinate, not incidental. He was connected, recognized, placed within a structure we did not understand but could no longer ignore. The human finally moved again, just a small motion, a slight tilt of his head that felt almost like a response, not submissive, not deferential, just familiar. "You made it," he said, his voice steady, unshaken, as if this exchange was not rewriting the rules of the room, as if it was simply continuing something that had already been established long before any of us were present. The entity's hum shifted again, softer this time, more contained, like a confirmation, like agreement. And in that quiet exchange, with no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, the entire dynamic of the station changed. Not just the cargo bay, but everything it represented, because if this human, this individual we had dismissed as small, insignificant, unworthy of attention, could stand in front of something like that and be addressed not as prey, not as subject, but as kin, then every assumption we had built our understanding on was incomplete. And as the silence settled once more, deeper now, heavier with meaning, I realized that we had not just witnessed a reversal, we had witnessed a correction, a revelation of a truth that had always been there, hidden beneath our expectations, waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored. And in that moment, with those two standing at the center of everything, the message became impossible to deny. We had been measuring strength all wrong, and the smallest figure in the room had just redefined it completely. No one spoke after that, not because they were afraid to, but because there was nothing left to say that would not sound wrong, the kind of wrong that exposes how little you understand about the situation you're standing in. The cargo bay, once loud and predictable, had become something else entirely, a place where every movement carried weight and every silence meant something. Gorith did not try to recover control, did not attempt to reinterpret what had just happened. He simply stood there, shoulders still squared but no longer asserting dominance, his gaze fixed on the human and the entity with a focus that bordered on disbelief. I could not blame him, because we had all just watched the same thing, we had all heard it, and none of it fit within the framework we had been using to navigate this station for years. The human, Ethan Cole, remained exactly as he had been, calm, centered, unaffected by the shift he had just caused, and that, more than anything else, made the moment feel complete because it confirmed that this was not new to him, not surprising, not even particularly significant. It was simply expected. The entity adjusted again, a slight realignment of its structure that brought it closer to a resting posture, the hum lowering into a quieter, more contained frequency, still present, still undeniable, but no longer demanding attention, as if the purpose of its arrival had already been fulfilled, and the purpose had been him. The human glanced briefly toward the far end of the bay, then back to the entity, a small motion that carried intent without explanation. And for a second, I thought he might say something more, something that would clarify what we were witnessing. But he did not. Instead, he did something far simpler, far more unsettling. He relaxed, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, just a subtle shift in posture that suggested the moment of importance had passed, as if everything that mattered had already happened, and the rest was just aftermath. Gorith finally moved, one careful step backward, then another, creating distance not just from the entity, but from the entire interaction, and that movement spread through the room like a quiet signal. Others following his lead, stepping back, repositioning, giving space not out of fear, but out of recognition, because whatever this was, it did not belong to us. We were not part of it. We were witnesses, nothing more. The human turned slightly, not away from the entity, but enough to acknowledge the rest of the room, his gaze passing over Gorith, over me, over the others who had been watching from the moment he entered. And there was no judgment there, no challenge, no need to prove anything, just a calm awareness, like he understood exactly how this looked from our perspective and did not find it worth addressing. And that was when it settled in fully, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet certainty that replaced everything else. We had misread him from the start, not just underestimated him, but fundamentally misunderstood what he represented. He had never been the smallest presence in the room. He had simply been the least obvious. The entity shifted one final time, a controlled movement backward, creating space between itself and the human, not withdrawing, not disengaging, just resetting its position now that the interaction was complete and the docking gates behind it remained open, waiting as if ready for whatever came next. The human took a step to the side, aligning himself with the path that led deeper into the station, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal again. The bay, the workers, the structure of the place we thought we understood. But it was not the same. It could not be, because the rules had changed, not officially, not in any documented system, but in the way we would interpret every future interaction, every new arrival, every assumption about who held power and why. And as Ethan Cole began to walk, unhurried, unchallenged, moving through the space that had once been filled with laughter at his expense, no one stopped him. No one spoke. No one even considered interfering, because the message had already been delivered in the clearest way possible, and it did not need to be repeated. We were no longer looking at a small human in a large world. We were looking at something we had failed to recognize until it was too late to pretend otherwise. And as he passed by, calm as ever, the only thought that remained, the only one that made sense, was that we had never been observing weakness. We had been standing in the presence of something far beyond our scale, something that did not need to prove itself, because it had already been acknowledged by the one thing in that room that mattered most. The moment he moved, the entire station seemed to adjust around him, not physically, not in any measurable way that a system could log or a sensor could record, but in perception, in priority, in the silent agreement that whatever had just occurred mattered more than anything that had come before it. Ethan Cole did not rush, did not look back, did not acknowledge the weight of the attention following him. He simply walked, steady and unhurried, across a floor that had minutes ago been filled with laughter directed at him, and now held nothing but space, clear, open, unquestioned. The workers closest to his path shifted instinctively, not stepping away in fear, but making room in a way that suggested understanding, as if some deeper instinct had overridden habit, telling them that standing in his way was not an option worth testing. Gorith remained where he was for a moment longer, watching, processing, recalibrating, and then he did something that none of us expected. He lowered his head slightly, not fully, not dramatically, just enough to register as acknowledgement, not submission, not surrender, but recognition, the kind given between forces that no longer need to prove anything to each other. And that single motion carried more weight than any confrontation ever could have, because it confirmed that even he, who had built his reputation on control and presence, understood that the hierarchy had shifted, not temporarily, not situationally, but fundamentally. The entity remained near the center of the bay, its massive form steady, its hum now reduced to a low, almost ambient resonance, no longer commanding attention, but still impossible to ignore, like a constant reminder of what had just been established. And as Ethan moved further away, the entity turned, not abruptly, not with any sense of urgency, just a smooth, deliberate reorientation that aligned it with his direction, not following in the traditional sense, not trailing behind like an escort, but adjusting its position to remain connected, to maintain that invisible line that had been drawn between them from the moment it entered the bay. And that was when the realization deepened into something more concrete. This was not a one-sided acknowledgement, not a moment of curiosity or coincidence. This was structure, relationship, something defined and stable, something that existed beyond this station, beyond this encounter, beyond anything we had previously considered possible. The docking gates behind the entity remained open, their amber lights steady, waiting, but now they felt less like an entry point and more like a threshold, something that marked the boundary between what we thought we understood and what we clearly did not. A few workers began to return to their tasks, slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether normal operations could resume. But even those movements were different now, quieter, more deliberate, because the environment itself had changed, not in function, but in meaning. Every crate, every piece of equipment, every routine action now existed in the context of what we had just witnessed, and nothing felt quite the same. I remained where I was, watching as Ethan approached the far side of the bay, his figure small against the scale of the station, and yet carrying a presence that made everything else feel secondary. And I realized that the size we had been measuring, the scale we had been using to define strength, had never been the right one. It had always been incomplete, because it ignored something more important, something that could not be seen at a glance, something that revealed itself only when the right conditions aligned. The entity paused once more near the center line, its form steady, its attention still connected to him even at a distance. And for a brief moment, the entire scene settled into a kind of quiet equilibrium, where everything was exactly where it needed to be, not by chance, but by design. And as Ethan reached the exit corridor, he slowed. Slightly, just enough to turn his head a fraction. Not enough to look back fully, just enough to acknowledge the space behind him. And though no words were spoken, the message was clear. This place, this moment, this entire sequence had never been about proving anything. It had been about revealing something that had always been there, hidden beneath assumptions and expectations, waiting for the right moment to surface. And now that it had, there was no putting it back, no returning to the old way of seeing things, because once a truth like that is exposed, it does not fade, it settles, it lingers, it reshapes everything that comes after. And as the doors to the corridor closed, behind him, sealing the moment into memory, the only thought that remained, clear and undeniable, was that we had not just witnessed a shift in power, we had witnessed a correction of perspective, one that would follow us long after the hum had faded and the bay had returned to its routine, because the next time we saw something small walk through those doors, none of us would be foolish enough to laugh. We did not return to normal. Not really. Even when the noise came back, even when the cargo lines resumed and the manifest started moving again, something fundamental had shifted beneath it all. something quiet but permanent. And you could see it in the smallest details, in the way workers glanced toward the docking gates a little longer than necessary, in the way conversations paused when a new arrival stepped through an airlock, in the way no one rushed to fill silence with laughter anymore. Because we had learned what silence could mean, we had learned that it could be the space before something important revealed itself. I stayed at my post, doing what I'd always done, logging shipments, verifying transfers, maintaining the rhythm of a station that depended on routine. But every time I looked up, I saw it differently, the scale of the bay, the size of the beings moving through it. The structures we had trusted to define power, all of it felt incomplete now, like we had been reading only part of a much larger system. Gorith changed too, though he would never admit it. His movements became more measured, his presence less about display and more about awareness. And he no longer laughed the same way, not with that easy certainty that had once filled the room, because certainty requires a stable understanding of the world, and that stability had been broken, not by force, not by confrontation, but by a simple correction, a quiet demonstration that everything we thought we knew had gaps we had never considered. The docking gates eventually closed, the amber lights returning to their steady blue, the hum fading until it became indistinguishable from the normal background of the station. But it never truly disappeared, not in our minds, not in the way we interpreted the world around us. It lingered, a memory of something larger, something that existed beyond our reach, but could step into our space at any moment. And that possibility changed everything. Because once you understand that you are not at the top of the structure you believed in, you start to question every level beneath it, every assumption, every judgment, every quick conclusion based on appearance or size or familiarity. And the next time a human walked through that airlock, no, one laughed, not even quietly, not even out of habit, because the image of Ethan Cole standing in the center of that bay, calm and unmoved, while something vast and undeniable acknowledged him as kin, had settled too deeply to ignore. It had rewritten the instinct that once triggered mockery into something else entirely, something closer to caution, closer to respect, closer to understanding. And I realized that this was how change actually happens, not through declarations or enforced rules, but through moments that cannot be forgotten, moments that reshape perception so completely that the old way of seeing the world simply stops making sense. We had not been corrected by words or authority. We had been corrected by reality itself, presented in a form we could not deny, and that correction stayed with us, shaping every interaction that followed, every decision, every judgment, because we now carried a new awareness, one that sat quietly beneath everything else, reminding us that strength is not always visible, that scale is not always physical, and that the most dangerous mistake you can make is assuming you understand something based on what you see at first glance. And in the end, that was the lesson we could not escape, the one that echoed long after the moment had passed, the one that redefined everything we thought we knew. We were wrong, not just about him, but about his entire species. We thought they were small, we thought they were weak, we thought they were out of place in a galaxy that valued size and force. But we had been measuring the wrong things all along, because what we saw that day was not an exception. It was a glimpse of the truth, a truth that would follow us long after the memory faded, a truth that would change the way we looked at every human who crossed our path, a truth that could be summarized in a single, undeniable realization. Humans were never the smallest beings in the room. They were simply the ones we understood the least. And now that we understood just a little more, we knew exactly where they stood, not beneath us, not beside us, but somewhere far above, in a place we had never even thought to look.